Oh my gosh. I love that song by Rabbi Shlomo Katz from Efrat in the Holy Land. It was actually Nina that introduced that song to me. I've introduced it to so many people. It's being used in services in LA. People love to sing it. That is the Rova Chuppah Nigun, originally a melody composed by Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach and played in a live setting. That's from the Live in Melbourne album by Shlomo Katz. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? We've got an amazing daf to explore today. Let's light up the darkness. Who is gonna be with us on this lovely Sunday evening in the midst of a holiday weekend in the United States? It's Labor Day weekend. Stephen Geger is with us saying shalom from Dover, New Hampshire. Yehudet Sobel from Florence, South Carolina. Nancy Brandemol Wright from Southern Pines, North Carolina. Debbie Schweigart from Barnegat, New Jersey. James Roth says shalom from Indianapolis. Sherry Henry Scheidel says shalom from Southwest Utah. Lee Ubriaco is with us from Ocala, Florida. Gwen Strong says, good evening, Melissa Itel Jurin is with us from Great Neck, New York. Harold Black is with Loretta in Oregon. Jan Moritz Brandt says best wishes from New Brunswick, New Jersey, from Steve and Jan. Dave Engel is with us from Minnesota. Lucy Ram Johnson says good evening from Minnesota. Hoping you get cooler weather soon. Yes, if you saw, today I actually blew our Elul shofar blast. We blow the shofar every day in Elul, the last month of the Hebrew year, as we prepare for Rosh Hashanah. Today was so hot in Los Angeles, I actually blew it while standing in a pool. It was 112 degrees at that moment. The weather forecast says it's going to get a little cooler in LA. Thank God. We're especially mindful of people for whom such hot weather could really be a difficulty, even a danger. May everybody come through this heat wave safely, and we say amen. Sandy McMurray says Michigan is in the house. Rochelle Rosen says good evening from Modesto. Sue Strauss in the house from Chicago. Peter Victor with us from Pittsburgh. Hillary Silver is with us from West Hartford. Over on the YouTube side, Neil is with us from Virginia. And Miracia says shalom from Atlanta, Georgia. All right. Where are we? We are on Daf Chaf Ches. That is page 28 of Tractate Eruvin, the third volume of the Talmud. We're in chapter 3 of Tractate Eruvin, still discussing Mishnah number 1. The general concept that's at work here is going to be the eruv techumin. What we do here is because we can only walk a certain distance on Shabbos. If we're in a city, we measure from the edge of the city and another 2,000 cubits. If we're out in the country, we measure from our dwelling. We can walk 2,000 cubits in any direction. That's the limit for Shabbos walking. Again, if you're in a city, you can walk throughout the city. This is not about carrying. This is simply about how far you can walk. If you live in a big city, you can walk very far within the city. But once you leave the city, only another 2,000 cubits. Now, if you want to go visit somebody who lives 3,000 cubits beyond the edge of the city or from your dwelling, you need to establish a legal Shabbos dwelling, right? It's kind of like a legal fiction. You're going to establish your dwelling for Shabbos somewhere between you and the place that you want to go to that's 3,000 cubits away. And that way, for the first 1,000 cubits, let's say, you're just walking toward your Shabbos dwelling, and then you have 2,000 more from there to get to your friend's house, let's say, for a nice Shabbos lunch. How do we establish that Shabbos dwelling? We deposit a basket of food in a location where we want to make the Shabbos dwelling. And now what we've been talking about yesterday and we'll continue today is about the requirements of the food that's going to be in that basket. So what we saw yesterday was the Mishna taught so we can establish that eruv with any kind of food at all except water and salt, water or salt, because those are considered, even though they're necessary for us, they're not nourishing, right? You couldn't live on water alone. You couldn't live on salt alone. We need those things, but they're not considered food for the purposes of establishing an eruv. And as we saw in the Mishnah, nor may we spend second tithe monies, maaser sheni, when we lived in ancient Israel and the temple was standing. Part of the tithing process is that we would set aside some money in certain years that we would use to go and make the festival pilgrimage to be in Jerusalem for Passover, for Shavuos, for Sukkot. And while we're in Jerusalem, we could spend that money on food to eat while we were in Jerusalem. And the verse in the Torah says, spend it on anything your heart desires, but then it gives examples on beef, on mutton, right? It says on an ox, on a sheep, or on new wine or old wine, anything your soul desires. And that verse, that the way that verse is formulated, we saw that it could be, at the end of yesterday, we saw it could be analyzed one of two ways, either as an amplification, a limitation, and an amplification, or a generalization, a specification, or a generalization. What was between them? Apparently what it ended up being, we're not going to go through that whole analysis, but what it ends up being, the question that came up is, can you spend it on fish? Can you spend it on fish? Why? Because according to one way of analyzing that verse, it seems that we can spend it on anything which is considered the offspring of the earth or the offspring of the offspring of the earth. In other words, anything that was generated from the earth, and were fish generated from the earth? Not in the creation story of the 6 days of creation, right? Let the waters teem with fish, said God, and the fish were generated within the water. So it's as if the fish were born in water, the original fish. They're the offspring of water in that sense. And every other kind of food is the offspring of land, whether it's a plant that grows on land or an animal that eats an animal that eats plants. Either way, it's the offspring of land. But the other view was that it's not the offspring of the ground, but rather the produce or the produce of the ground. In other words, anything that is sustained by the ground, right? So everything that's on land is sustained by the ground. It eats food. Either we eat animals that eat plants or we eat plants themselves. So can fish be considered as if they are sustained from the ground? Yes, they can. There's a ground on the ocean floor, right? There are creatures in the ocean that eat what's on the ocean floor. There are creatures that come up on land, eat plants and then go out into the ocean. And in any case, even though it's somewhat indirect, we can consider that in an indirect way, fish are, they are sustained by the ground like other life in this world. And therefore, we can use maaser sheni funds, the second tithe, when we make that pilgrimage to Jerusalem, when the temple is standing. And we can establish an eruv with fish. So that settles that question from yesterday. Now we come to a new wrinkle on setting up an eruv so that we can walk further, right? An eruv techumin, so that we can walk further in that direction. We need to move our dwelling to another place, and we establish it with a basket of food. Rav Yehuda said, in the name of Rav Shmuel bar Shelat, in the name of Rav. So it's 3 generations, 2 generations after him, bringing down a teaching of the great sage Rav. What did Rav say? He said that an eruv may be created with cheap, insignificant produce like cress, purslane, or sweet clover. In other words, produce that's edible, but that's cheap, it's plentiful, and we don't normally bother to eat it because there's better produce for us to eat. There's nice romaine lettuce, there's buttercup lettuce, there's tomatoes, there's arugula, there's kale, there's spinach. There's better, more tasty, more expensive, more desirable produce to eat. But these leafy vegetables can be eaten. Some people eat them. And therefore, says Rav, we can use them to establish the eruv. But we may not establish an eruv, says Rav, with green grain or unripe dates. And that kind of makes sense, just logically speaking. We're going to analyze this teaching more. But just logically, at first hearing, it makes sense, right? We want to make the eruv with food. Things that is ready to be food. Green grain, meaning like wheat that wasn't fully ripe when it was harvested, wheat that's not ready to be turned into flour, unripe grain, or unripe dates. I mean, a fruit before it's ripe is not good. Nina often brings home peaches and nectarines and plums and other kinds of fruit that are not quite ripe from the supermarket. And, the idea is that tomorrow these will be ripe, and then on the next day some of these will be ripe. And, over the next few days, gradually some of these fruits will become ripe. So we'll have ripe fruit each day. But sometimes the kids look at that fruit and it's like, oh, it looks so good. It's so sweet. And they pick it up and it's hard, but so what? They just want to eat that fruit. And then, okay, so they bite into it and it's not so sweet. And they realize, no, it wasn't ready, right? That's a lesson we learn as we get older. Unripe fruit is not ready for eating. The Gemara says, but wait a minute. You just said in the name of Rav that sweet clover is one of the types of produce that could be used to make an eruv. But there's a problem with sweet clover because didn't we learn elsewhere in the Talmud and in other teaching that sweet clover should only be eaten by somebody who already has a lot of children? Why? Because eating sweet clover, it's a particular species of clover, impairs one's reproductive system. So one who eats sweet clover, maybe who eats a lot, who knows, is going to have trouble having children because of the sweet clover. And not only that, but if the sweet clover hardened to the point where it was going to be like a seed, then no one may eat it because it's harmful to everybody, not just for the reproduction, but just harmful generally. So, if it's harmful generally when it gets to be a seed, but even when it's soft, it's harmful to people that would like to have children, and it should only be eaten by people who already have had a lot of children and would rather not have more children, or they're past childbearing age, let's say, how could we establish an eruv with such a food? Rather, what we meant to say, right? Gemara says, what Rav must have meant to say is that soft, sweet clover may be eaten by one who already has many children, And even one who doesn't have many children, who wants to have children, may still use the sweet clover in the eruv because it's fit to be eaten by the one who's already had many children. In other words, this is a food that should only be eaten by some people and not others. So can the ones who shouldn't eat it make an eruv out of it? Yes, they can. Because even though they're not going to eat it, all it has to be, the food in that basket, is fit to be eaten by somebody. It doesn't have to be them. And we already learned that lesson in the Mishna because we saw that you can put wine in an eruv, which is good for everybody except a nazir, somebody who took a vow not to drink wine. So he is legally forbidden to drink wine because of his own vow. No one made him take the vow, but once he took the vow, he is forbidden to drink wine for the length of his Naziris. As long as he vowed that he wouldn't eat it, that he wouldn't drink it, he can't. But we can still establish an eruv for the Nazir with wine because somebody else, it's fit for somebody else to drink it. That's all that's necessary. And likewise, we could use teruma, which is food that's set aside in the tithing process only to be eaten by priests. In fact, teruma is consecrated, it acquires holiness, and that's why it can only be eaten by priests. But we can make an eruv with teruma, even for an Israel, by somebody who's not a priest, because it's fit to be eaten by someone, in this case, the priest. So it's okay. The Gemara continues. And is it also true? Right, so Rav said, okay, so we can use sweet clover. Now we understand Rav is right. It's okay to use sweet clover. But Rav said that we may not use green grain, right? Unripe grain. And the Gemara challenges this and says, and is it true that we may not use green grain? Rav Yehuda said, in the name of Rav. Okay, so we just heard that Rav said we may not use green grain. But now we have this other teaching that Rav Yehuda said, in the name of Rav, that we may use green grain and dodder, which is another plant we're going to discuss in a moment. We may use either green grain or dodder in an eruv. And in that teaching, we learn that the blessing that we say when we eat either green grain or dodder, according to Rav, is Borei Pri Ha'adama. In other words, we would say, before eating it, we would say, blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who creates the fruit of the ground. Right, so that's the blessing for all vegetables, leafy vegetables, root vegetables. The fruit of the ground covers everything that grows in the ground and above the ground, but doesn't grow from a tree. If it grows from a tree, then it would be the fruit of the tree. But everything else is the fruit of the ground. So we learned from Rav what the blessing was, and more important for this situation, that we can use green grain. So now we have two teachings of Rav, who said we may not use green grain in an eruv, and we may use green grain in an eruv. So what's going on? The Gemara explains. Rav ruled against using green grain before he came to the Jewish community in Bavel, in Babylonia. And there he saw people eating green grain. They would use it in a certain way, prepare it in a certain way so that it was edible and tasty. Where he came from, Israel, from the Holy Land, which at that time was, dominated and oppressed by the Roman Empire. But anyway, at any rate, people did not eat green grain in Israel, but they did eat it in Babylonia. So once he saw that people ate it and that it was a legitimate food, he said, okay, so you can use it in an eruv. But now we have another question. So Rav said that the blessing for both dodder and green grain is Borei Pri Ha'adama. Okay, dodder. What is dodder? Dodder is an interesting plant. There's a picture here. Maybe you can see this. That's dodder. And what you're looking at is a plant that's kind of pretty. It has little flowers, but it's a parasite. It is not a plant that puts roots into the ground. Rather, this plant, like the seeds get blown around, and then it lands on another plant, and then it starts growing its little tendrils around the host plant, the stems of the host plant, and then it inserts little barbs into the host plant, and it draws its nutrient from this host plant. It's a parasitic plant. Okay, so that's what dodder is. Remember that? And green grain is unripe grain. So now we have a little story, very colorful. And this is about Rabbi Zeira. We've talked about Rabbi Zeira a bunch of times before. A great, great sage, very pious, a very, very beautiful soul, and extremely learned and wise. There are some great stories. When we get to Tractate Megillah, we're going to get the story of Rabbah and Rav Zeira and how they celebrated Purim together. I told it before. I'll probably tell it again when we get to Purim in February or March of next year. At any rate, Rabbi Zeira had a very interesting practice. When his Torah study became too exhausting for him, this is not a guy who studied Torah, for 1 hour a day or 2 hours a day or 5 hours a day. This is a guy who all his life was studying 8, 10, 12 hours a day. I mean, he could not get enough Torah. He was always learning, always seeking to expand his wisdom, always seeking to understand God's will more perfectly. His heart was just so attached to the Lord, and he just wanted to understand God's wisdom in all areas of life as it's been brought down to him through the tradition of the sages, going all the way back to the revelation at Mount Sinai when God gave the Torah. Rabbi Zeira was always studying. But at times, even the great Rabbi Zeira is just too much. I mean, it's like his eyes were swimming, he had a headache, he just couldn't learn anymore, right? Anybody who's ever studied for finals knows at a certain point, you just can't learn anymore. So most people, when they just can't learn anymore, when they're too exhausted, what do? They watch a little TV, they read a book, they go for a walk, they do a workout, maybe they just eat. What did Rabbi Zeira do? Rabbi Zeira at that point would get up and he would go to a nearby yeshiva, an academy of Torah learning near where he was learning, right? Near where he was studying, maybe near his home. And this was the yeshiva of Rabbi Yehuda bar Ami. And he would sit by the entrance of Rabbi Yehuda bar Ami's yeshiva. Why? Because students, Torah scholars, teachers and students, Torah scholars, would come and go from Rabbi Yehuda bar Ami's yeshiva. And so, since they would come and go, they would walk past Rabbi Zeira, who was sitting near the entrance to the yeshiva. And whenever a Torah scholar would pass him, he would stand up to honor the Torah scholar who was walking by. And it's a mitzvah to honor Torah scholars. Think of the piety, the sweet piety of Rabbi Zeira, that when he was too tired to learn, at least he could honor others who were learning. It's amazing. And yesterday I was sort of reaching for a good kal vachomer, right? A kal vachomer is a type of learning, a type of principle of learning. Here's an example. If it's a mitzvah and one receives merit and reward for honoring Torah scholars by standing when one of them walks by and greeting them and honoring them, how much more merit does a person gain from enabling Torah scholars to learn and to teach Torah, right? So when you enable Torah study, it's a huge merit. And I will say, we are in Elul, the last month of the year. This is a time to increase our mitzvahs, particularly to increase giving to righteous causes, and to support Torah study is especially propitious at this time. So it's a very good time to donate to organizations that teach Torah. You could donate to Chabad.org, you could donate to Aish, you could donate to your favorite yeshiva, and you could donate to Accidental Talmudist. Donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. Nina will put the link in the comments because we share Torah with multitudes, and it is definitely a merit to you that will be counted in your account when you come before the heavenly court at Rosh Hashanah and at the end of your life, whenever that should be. It should be many years away. You should live to 120. But anytime you enable Torah study, it's a big merit to you and your loved ones. Okay, let me just Sorry, get my computer in front of me. Okay, so that's what Rabbi Zeira would do. So he was doing that. He was sitting by the entrance of Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ami's yeshiva, greeting Torah scholars as they would come and go. And in that yeshiva, they taught all ages, young and old. And a school child, literally a school child, imagine a fourth grader, came walking out of the yeshiva. And Rabbi Zeira greeted him, hello, young scholar, and asked him, what did you learn today? So the student said to Rabbi Zeira, this fourth grader said to Rabbi Zeira, he said to him, today we learned the correct blessing to say over dodder and green grain. So this is why this teaching is being brought down, as we've been talking about dodder and green grain. Now recall that Rav said over both of them, when we eat them, we say, Borei Pri Ha'adamah, blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who creates the fruit of the earth. The boy said to Rabbi Zeira, we learned at school today that over dodder, we say, Borei Pri Ha'adamah, blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who creates the fruit of the ground. Over green grain, we say, Shakol Nihiyeh B'divaro. We say, blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, by whose word everything comes into being. That's sort of like the catch-all blessing. When a food doesn't fit into one of the categories that have specific blessings and we're going to eat it, then we say Shakol, by whose word everything comes into being. For example, that's the blessing we say over water. And if we were eating meat by itself, we would say Shakol Nihiyeh B'divaro. So Rabbi Zeira thought about that, and he said to the child, well, actually, it would make more sense to reverse those. Because dodder, you're saying it's fruit of the earth, but dodder grows on other plants. It grows in the air. It never has roots in the ground. So it's not sustained. It's not nourished from the ground. It's nourished from the air, as it were. And green grain, right? And green grain, it does grow in the ground. So you should say Borei Pri Ha'adamah over the green grain, since it's coming up out of the ground. You should switch those blessings, said Rabbi Zeira to the school child. We're almost at the end of our class today, so if you have questions, comments, put them in now. The Gemara comments on this story that the halacha, the law, does not accord with Rabbi Zeira, the great sage. It accords with the school child. I mean, the school child was repeating what he learned at school that day, but in this story, the school child gets the merit, and the Talmud says the law accords with this child. Why? Why? Because dodder is a fully ripened product, right? It's not too young. Like, you can eat dodder and it's fully developed, right? We're not waiting for it to ripen. It's itself. It has already reached the stage of what it's going to be, and we eat it as this. It is the thing. And why do we say Borei Pri Ha'adamah on something which seems to be growing in the air? Not really in the air. It's a parasite, so it's attached to another plant. But the fact is, if we were to cut the host plant off at the ground, the dodder would die also. The sages were able to see that, there are some plants that get nourished from the air. Maybe somebody can put the name of those kinds of plants in the comments. I can't remember right now, but there are plants that actually get nourished from the air, but dodder's not one of them. It's a parasite. It sinks its hooks into the host plant. If you kill the host plant, in other words, if you cut it off from the ground, the dodder will die too. Therefore, the dodder, which is a fully developed plant and is getting nourished from the ground, it's correct to say Borei Pri Ha'adamah, that this is a fruit of the earth. And the green grain is not fully developed, right? When it is fully developed, then maybe we would say Borei Pri Ha'adamah, or in the case of a grain, we'd actually say Borei Minei Mizonos. There's a special blessing for grains. But at any rate, we wouldn't say Shehakol Nihiyeh B'divaro when it's complete, when it's finished, when it's fully developed. But now, since we can eat it, it is edible, but it is not the creation that it's destined to be. right? When it's a fully developed grain. So when we're eating something that's unripe, that is not its fully developed self, what we learn out from here is that then we say shehakol. Then we say by whose word everything comes into being. Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, by whose word everything comes into being. And it's almost like we're praising God that even your, immature, undeveloped plants and fruits can be eaten by us, and how much greater are the fully developed, the ripe fruits and vegetables and plants that you've created for us. Blessed are you, Lord our God. And that's what I've got for us today. So it's a nice and colorful story, right? And again, when we encounter a story like that, it's good to learn from it. It's good to learn the principle. It's good to see that. And by the way, Rav was overruled, right? So Rav said that both dodder and green grain receive borei pri adama, but we see no, green grain, which is not yet finished, it's not yet complete, should have had shehakol. So Rav was overruled, and Rabbi Zeira was overruled, and the little boy had it right because he learned it correctly at school. But Rabbi Zeira and we are learning out from the child, right? We can often learn great lessons from children. And the fact that this story is included is so important, right? When you think about if you were creating a holy book which was meant to enshrine the wisdom of our sages over many generations, would you include stories where they are bested by a child? Would you include stories like yesterday where one of them was a little bit rude and impulsive and didn't check with another sage, right? We saw that, who was it? It was Rava, pulled out a row of sticks that was being used as a partition to create the possibility of carrying from the house of the Reish Galusa, the exilarch, to the pavilion in his karpef, in his enclosure. And Rava thought it wasn't necessary, and rather than discussing it with other people, he just pulled it out of the ground. It turned out he was wrong, right? So would you include stories where sages end up looking wrong, where they end up looking rude, where they end up looking impulsive, where they get bested by children? You wouldn't, right? You'd want to make them look as good as possible so that everybody would be sure to admire them and follow all their wisdom. But that's not the way the Talmud works. The Talmud records, it's an honest record of these discussions that went on over hundreds of years to figure out God's will. And nobody, not a prophet, not a sage, not a rabbi, not an elder, nobody is superior to the Word of God. Everyone has to be humble before the Word of God. And in the process of figuring out what God wants us to do in every situation, we're all working hard to figure it out. Having said that, obviously our sages and even more our prophets, they're just so many levels above us. Of course we should listen to them. But the fact that the editors of the Talmud, who are sages themselves, record stories like this, it's a beautiful lesson, right? It's a beautiful lesson in our own humility. And when we're so convinced that we're right, we shouldn't be so sure, and we should be willing to ask questions, and we should be willing to learn from anybody who brings us the truth. All right, let's look at questions and comments. Amy Kulesa says, in the absence of the temple, do those of the priestly line still have special regulations in the Torah that still apply to aspects of their lives today? Absolutely. It's a great question, Amy. So first of all, like any Jewish man who's born of a Jewish woman and whose last name is Cohen, so he's a Cohen. He's going to be a descendant of the priestly line. There are other names. You don't have to be named Cohen to be a Cohen. How do you know you're a Cohen? Your dad told you. He was a Cohen, and he told you that you're a Cohen too. There's an old joke about that. We don't need to tell it right now. So what do Kohanim, the plural of Cohen, what do Kohanim do today? They have a few obligations. The main one is that they bless the congregation. right? In Israel, they actually do this every day. Outside of Israel, we do it at certain holidays, at certain parts of the service, like during the Musaf, Amida, the additional service in the morning service on Rosh Hashanah and on Yom Kippur and on Sukkot and on Passover and on Shavuos. So there comes a time in the service when the Kohanim are going to bless the congregation. Before they bless, they need to leave the room and have their hands washed. Not wash their hands, have their hands washed. By who? By the tribe that serves the Kohanim, the Levites. So I'm a Levite, and my son, obviously, I'm a Levite, so my sons are Levites. So my son and I will leave the room at that same time. All the Leviim who are in the congregation will go out with the Kohanim, and we'll fill a cup that's meant for hand washing, ritual hand washing, and we'll pour water over the hands of the Kohanim so that they're sort of spiritually, ritually ready to bless the congregation. Then they'll come back in, they'll remove their shoes, they'll actually cover their heads with a prayer shawl, and we in the congregation will cover our heads too. We're not supposed to look into the eyes of the Kohanim when they're blessing us because they're channeling such a powerful spiritual energy. And how do they bless us? It's the blessing that we also say over our children on Friday nights, but it's the Kohanic blessing. They will say to us, "May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord countenance you and be gracious to you. May the Lord favor you and grant you peace." They'll sing it, and it's a very long and beautiful melody. The Kohanim aren't necessarily great singers, but they're led by the cantor who sort of says each phrase of the blessing first, and then they repeat after him, and they sing it, and it's a very, very moving service. So that's an important obligation that the Kohanim still have. And God willing, maybe even in our lifetimes, maybe tomorrow, maybe today, the temple will be rebuilt in Jerusalem. The Messiah will come. The temple will be rebuilt. The Kohanim will be gathered, and they'll start to officiate and perform the divine service in the temple. But until then, one of the things that they do is bless the congregation at holidays. Nina's reminding me that you said that if your name is Cohen, it means you're Cohen, but many people with the last name Cohen aren't Kohanim. Well, maybe not. Maybe not. But if you're Jewish, born of a Jewish mother, and your father's name was Cohen, it's very likely that you're a Cohen. But if your father didn't tell you that you're a Cohen, then it's very possible that you're not. Right? So sometimes these traditions get broken. It's very sad, right? Somebody who was a Cohen goes out, is just not religious anymore, like doesn't tell anyone he's a Cohen, doesn't tell his kids he's a Cohen. Those kids grow up, they don't know they're Cohens. And there are other names. You don't have to be named Cohen. Rappaport is often a Cohen. There's some names that are associated. So no, there's no guarantee that a person named Cohen is of the priestly line. There's no guarantee, but often they are. Lynn says, so an eruv cannot be established only with the partition devices, but food is required by the parties involved. How does that work with a citywide eruv? Right? This is what's tricky about an eruv. The word eruv gets used for related but different ideas, right? So to move your dwelling for Shabbos, there we need to use the food, right? So that's the eruv techumin. It's to move our dwelling so we can walk further in that direction. When houses that share a courtyard people want to be able to carry throughout that courtyard, or when courtyards that share an alleyway, what we were studying in chapter 1, for them to create that eruv, there's going to be an exchange of food that they'll all sort of, and they might designate people as their agent to deposit some food in the home of one of them on behalf of all of them, and then they can all carry within that area. In terms of making a food deposit for a community eruv, I'm not sure how that works. I haven't looked that up, and I'm not sure how that works. There probably is, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure how food deposit works in that situation. But what we're talking about today is the eruv techumin, right? So that's to move our dwelling in that direction so we can walk further in that direction than we would otherwise be allowed. Amy Kless asks, how does one know if he's a Levite? Because your dad told you. That's how you know, and you don't know otherwise. Again, if your name is Levi, there's a higher likelihood that you are, but no guarantee. Leventhal, Levine, these names make it possible, maybe a little bit more probable, but definitely not a guarantee. And really the way it works is it's been passed down from generation to generation. My dad told me we're Levium. That's how I know. I told my son. That's how he knows. He'll tell his son, God willing. And that's how it works. And isn't it amazing that this tradition, that this knowledge that you're part of that tribe, it's pretty amazing. If you're a Levite, by the way, the Kohanim, they're descendants of Aaron. Anyone who's a Kohen, it means that he's physically a descendant of Moshe's brother, Aaron, right? Moshe and his brother Aaron were both Levites. So there's 11 other tribes, but most people don't know what tribe they're descended of, right? You're called a Jew because your people come from Judea. That was one of the tribes, the tribe of Judah. The rest of Israel sort of contained 10 other tribes. There was Judea, and there was Benjamin was also associated with that. And we say the lost tribes of Israel, because the northern kingdom was defeated by Assyria, and Judea lasted much longer. That's why we're called Jews today. But most Jews are just called Israelites, just children of Israel, because they don't know what tribe they're from. Some people maybe have a tradition that they know what tribe they're from, but I haven't met somebody who says such a thing. But Levites know that they're Levites, and Cohens know that they're Cohens, right? Kohanim, right? That's all we know. And you only know that because it was passed down from father to son. But it's amazing that it's been passed down for 3,000 years. It's extraordinary. Where is... Yosef Shum says, where is the first Mishnah concerning food for an eruv? Well, we're studying the first Mishnah of chapter 3, and this is talking about food for an eruv. When we talked in chapters 1 and 2, in chapter 1 about making an adjustment for a mavoy, an alleyway that courtyards open into it, it was just sort of assumed that there was, that there was food deposited into one of those houses. But we didn't discuss it, and we didn't discuss it when we were talking about adjusting a karpef, an enclosure that wasn't originally enclosed to be a residential enclosure. But the first Mishnah in which we're talking about food for an eruv, in Tractate Eruvin, is here, the first Mishnah of chapter 3. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Tomorrow in the United States is Labor Day. Let's honor the working people of America, everybody who works for a living, who provides for their family. They should be honored, and the United States of America gives the day off to everyone who can take a day off to honor them for their work. So we honor everybody who works hard and provides for their family, and we especially honor the people who can't take the day off tomorrow. Essential workers, policemen, firemen, hospital workers, etc. All the people who can't take a day off tomorrow, even on Labor Day. We salute you. Have a great, great evening, my holy brothers and sisters. And with God's help, we'll meet again tomorrow to continue our learning of Tractate Eruvin with Daf page 29. All the best. Have a great night. I'm being slow to turn it off because it often cuts off